Have you ever played Kingsfield? I have. It wasn't hugely popular at the time, but it did leave a legacy. I'm not sure I'm qualified to get into the entirety of that at the time. Consider this though, a game to be not exactly fun right away, but rewarding. It's a build-up and a payoff that rewards you for overcoming obstacles. In fact, I think this is an entirely enjoyable position for a game to sidle into. Lunacid takes inspiration from the Kingsfield series and twists it into a unique vision all its own. It opens hot directly into exposition, which is traditional for an RPG, especially of the era it takes inspiration from. Done right, intro exposition dumps must be informative and yet leave room for the player to wonder, want to learn more about the world. Most importantly, an intro dump needs to be brief enough that your eyes don't glaze over and you stop paying attention. It's not bad here. The opening definitely leaves so many more questions than answers, but so do a lot of things in Lunacid. You learn that the world is basically ruined beyond repair and exists in a permanent, post-apocalyptic state of the world-eating god variety. And then you're dumped down a giant well for refuse. You know, dead people, thieves, murderers, that kind of refuse. So anyway, this old man carts you off to the well, dumps your body, and cuts off your hand. Don't worry, he'll get his too. You'll now be in the character creation screen to build your ideal beginning character, and don't sweat this too much because aside from a few particulars in class choice, you'll find that you can build your character in practically any way you want once you've gotten a few levels under your belt. Those class particulars may give you a reason to take another playthrough though, in the long run. At this point you'll no doubt be experiencing the game's aesthetics. Lunacid leans so heavily on the PlayStation art style it perched on top like a cat and knocked the affine texture warping off onto the floor. Don't worry though, if it's too clean for you, there are a handful of tools at your disposal to give it some other flavor. Before I get too deep into the visual presentation, I would like to take a pit stop at the audio. The sound effects are functional while not overly weighty. You can certainly tell what kind of surface you're banging on with your weapon, as in whether or not you're hitting a shield, bone, shell, flesh, etc. Most of the sound effects are something you'll just get used to over time, and adds to the way you experience Lunacid. One sound effect in particular, though, gave me PTSD flashbacks to Kingsfield. That was the screaming sound of the obsidian skeletons. If you know, you know. The music, on the other hand, is mostly atmospheric. It's really quiet by default, but really does add to the atmosphere. There's also a few tracks in here that just absolutely slap. One thing I thought was kind of neat, actually, is when a new track starts, it'll pop up with like a little message at the bottom left corner telling you which track is starting. And each environment has its own track associated with it. That was a really cool way of making each area distinct in tone and feel. The way Lunacid is designed around low-res textures and blocky geometry means that you could apply all kinds of filtering to the image quality and it's still going to convey the right visuals. I am one that enjoys the game adding its own visual filters to choose from in that regard, but for the sake of the review, I used the default. When revisiting the game, I found that I actually prefer the default look to the other options available. Darkness is one recurring theme. You'll get acquainted with it early, and while it's not pervasive throughout the whole experience, there are many areas that are going to challenge navigation due to the darkness alone. To aid with this, there are several tools for combating the darkness as well. Early on, there's going to be a torch and a spell that grants a small light source that follows you around. Later, if a moderately thorough search or dedication is applied, there are weapons that illuminate a small area around the wielder. And much later on in the adventure, and as reward for specific accomplishments, the player will be presented with small trinkets that trade light for a slot on your belt. I wanted to dislike this mechanic. It can slow the pace down. However, this isn't a game to be breezed through anyway. It's methodical, it's deliberate, each area can be prepared for individually, and that not only eases the challenge to a reasonable degree, but will often lead to finding secrets diegetically. For example, a secret door may have a groove above it on the wall where a wall piece slides in. In a dark crypt, you'll see it if you have ample lighting. There may be a platform above you in places you can't normally reach, and you'll only see it if you're looking up. You can subsequently only climb it if your character has the necessary stats or spells to do such. So, no, I actually liked this mechanic. That's not for the mechanic alone, it's because Lunacid is built in a way that asks so many different things from the player. Then it paces everything else around that. In darker areas, there are less enemies and more ambush-equivalent positions. Creeping through the dark, torch in hand, paying careful attention to everything you hear is going to lead you to finding those secrets, or getting the drop on enemies that were waiting for you. Contrasting that, brighter areas have a focus on more numerous, slightly faster, and often a little more dangerous combat, and build level-based puzzles in other ways that ask you to think about something rather than simply find it. Every area in Lunacid is distinct. The music, the ambient sounds, the level design, architecture, geometry, textures, and enemies, down to the very last detail, are all unique to the area that you're in. Some enemies may function similarly to other enemies in other areas, but that's as close as you'll get with very few exceptions, but only ones that fit the lore, like skeletons. You can find those in multiple areas, and those are often previous victims of the pit. Another exception is that there's also a hidden arena with various enemies from throughout the game. The environmental storytelling goes hard. Very hard. Allow me to demonstrate. The first real area has mummies with giant holes where their faces should be. One journal you can find in this area tells how these monks were collectively so focused on leaving the pit that they created a collective with the sole focus of finding a way to exist outside the pit. To go up, out. You can examine the remains to find that their brains have crawled out, that these holes were made from the inside. Later on, in a completely optional, missable area, you'll find these brains. They can float now. They still haven't left. In fact, they're actually like 50 feet directly up from where they started, in a library. They've all been distracted by the pursuit of knowledge and power. This pit is where they remain in doing so. Teaching the books how to do what they've done, yes, I just said that, to become alive in the process, deny gravity, and violently protect this library and its wealth of information from intruders. One of them even found his way up there, with body intact, just to do the same. Hidden away in a small pantry of a secret area. This is where you'll find one of the more unique spells in the game, corpse transformation. It will do that. It transforms yourself into a corpse. Yep, dead. That's what it does. I picked it up and got curious, thinking it couldn't just be that. And then I promptly had to load my last save. Speaking of loading and thinking of menus, the interface in Lunacid is extremely easy to navigate. You can read just about everything in the menus from across the room. It's large, and it takes up the entire screen real estate, but honestly, that's not a bad route to go with the menus because they aren't cluttered with hundreds of options. I could take it or leave it, personally. The HUD elements are non-intrusive and very standard. There's no extra flair to them. That's not a complaint, mind you. It has to be this way to fit with the rest of the aesthetic. The HUD is very informative and, in this sense, clean. That's good because you will be counting on that HUD throughout gameplay. So, about that gameplay. At first, Lunacid is scary. You can lose a lot of progress with one wrong move. This is because you're limited to saving only at these crystals dotted around the world. One each for most major areas. The crystals also serve as a fast travel between other crystals you've found and the hub area, and also as the only places you can spend your experience to level up your character. The hub area has the highest concentration of NPCs that aren't trying to kill you. 4. One who brought you here, one who sells you cool stuff, one for crafting things provided you're in the right situation for that, and one very dead, very drunk on health potions skeleton. He's got stories. Some of these stories shed some much needed light on the world. He's the go-to guy for the juicy lore. The lore is drip-fed to you through dialogue with NPCs and scattered around the world to be unearthed little by little as you explore. Very King's Field, the way the lore is handled. If you're paying enough attention, there's a reason for just about everything that happens. If not, that's okay, it happens anyway. The gameplay can be loosely broken down into two categories: combat and puzzles and exploration. With that in mind, the best place to start is the combat. Engaging in bloodshed is often the only way to progress and is the sole method of gaining experience. Don't worry about it getting unbearably difficult either, actually. If you leave an area and return, so will the enemies. This means that if the world gets a bit too tough for where your stats are at the moment, grinding is an option. Your levels and stats do matter, but having the wrong build can always be fixed by adding a few more stats. The enemies you'll come up against are going to have a variety of attack patterns, and taking the time to learn them is going to teach you how to dispatch them with little to no cost of your own. That's going to be important for delving deep into those dangerous areas. Nothing regenerates on its own. Your health, your mana, they're all currencies you trade for progress. How much you trade is up to you. Surprises can cost you greatly. The first time encountering any given enemy type can surprise you just as much, if not more, than a well-hidden enemy that jumps out at you. You never know when something is going to be hostile on sight, or what it is that is going to try to use to kill you, until it does. To help with your survival, there are some mechanics that you will have to get familiar with. The first of which is charging your attacks. The bar at the top right shows you how much of your attack is charged, and the spell icon at the top right, as well as the crosshair overlay, demonstrate how charged your spell is. You must charge your spells or they won't cast, and the time required for that is governed by the intelligence stat. Ranged attacks are ridiculously inaccurate unless you charge them, and then melee attacks are piss weak unless you charge them, or the weapon has a secondary function that does something different when it's charged. Another incredibly important aspect of the combat is reach. No matter what build you choose to go with, melee combat is going to range from a fallback to your primary source of attacking. This applies to most enemies as well, so weapon reach or attack reach works both ways. If you choose a weapon with a long reach, you are likely to have a safer engagement in combat at the cost of using a slower weapon. One thing, and maybe the most important thing, is speed. The speed stat determines only how fast the player moves. Having said that, I will also say, this is the most powerful stat in the game. When engaged in melee combat, nothing is more powerful than being able to close in and attack and simply back up to avoid the counterattack. You can achieve that goal with speed alone, or the reach of your weapons, or a dynamic shift during combat. I'm talking about dismemberment. Repeatedly attacking the same body part can remove it. It's more of a roll of the dice and not extremely reliable, but if you're surrounded by mummies dragging and swinging greatswords, try cutting that arm off. It works extremely effectively. The enemies will find another way to attack you, but if you remove their favorite method of attacking, they'll become immediately less effective. There is another aspect, which is only as important as you make it. Some, not all, weapons have their own experience bar. Now, when that bar is full and your character's experience with that weapon has come to a climax, it is as simple as taking that weapon back to the hub and improving it yourself at the forge. This can do anything from give the weapon boosted stats to unique and strange properties. Due to the slower initial pacing, many enemy attacks are going to be telegraphed hard. Even if you don't have the time to react or speed to evade, you'll often know what the enemy is going to do before it does the thing. You just won't know what that thing is until after it occurs. The first time at least. At that point though, some attacks will be worth risking to deal more damage, and others will make it more important to prioritize avoidance and just wait out the action or use a different tactic. If you take time to learn the enemies of each area and plan ahead, equipping yourself to maximize your effectiveness, you'll find that you'll have a much easier time exploring the world. To coincide with this point, you'll also learn what tactics and weapon types work better for you in a general sense. Each area has something unique and likely awesome hiding in it somewhere. If you've played Lunacid, you probably know which one I'm about to bring up, but Down in the sewer, I found a gated-off area I could only access through an aqueduct. In that area, I found the broken hilt of a sword. Now, in this game, some weapons do have the ability to level up by being used, so once their individual experience is maxed out, they can be upgraded at the hub. At first, this weapon was complete shit, but it was able to be leveled up. That made me extremely curious, so I went ahead, back to the first area, and banged on a bunch of mummies until it was maxed out. Then, upon upgrading it, I was granted the Flame Sword. It's a sword with a blade of flame. That means that not only does it do fire damage instead of normal damage, but it casts light. For those two reasons, it was a mainstay for the early game. So much of Lunacid is built in this interconnected way that every system plays off of another system or directly off of the lore, seemingly without fail. And I'm not kidding when I say this, but being inspired by Kingsfield and other FromSoft games is actually part of the lore. It makes sense too, FromSoft games share a lot of small pieces of lore with each other. Patchouli is but one perfect example of this. She's a bitch, and she thinks it would be hilarious if you died. At first, this didn't dawn on me. It didn't dawn on me when she sent me on a suicide mission, and it didn't dawn on me when I returned some guy's skull to her from an exceedingly environmentally dangerous area. It dawned on me when I was in trouble and decided to pop the top off of a handful of discount health potions that she sold me. They were full of poison, and not the kind of poison that you walk off. The kind of poison that reminds you that you forgot to save. So another perfect example of this is the Moonlight Sword. In a secret, you can find a coffin. Climb in this coffin. Seal yourself in. It falls into a river and takes you downstream. Sound familiar? Anyway, upon exiting the coffin, you're presented with a door and a sign. The sign mentions a 50-round arena with a very specific treasure at the end. I wasted no time. There are some rewards every 5 fights, and really they're not bad either. However, at the end is a shrine with what looks like it could be a nod to the Erd Tree, and yes, that started with Kingsfield, and the Moonlight Sword. It does Moonlight Sword stuff, and at that point was entirely overpowered. Don't worry, it's not broken, it's just a late game weapon I found in the mid game. If you're picking up what Lunacid is laying down, most of the puzzles it gives you are done in a way that makes so much sense in context. Some of them had me scratching my head, but a lot of them came to me pretty fast, and they'll build you up to feel like a genius. It works, and it works because all of the puzzles make sense within the game itself. Developer Akira has built a world, and you're traveling through it, learning how this world works. Using that knowledge alone, the puzzles all make sense. If you're stuck, all you typically need to do is think about how the world around you operates. I literally solved some of the puzzles by accident just because I thought it would be neat to do something that would make sense within the context of the world and the story. If that doesn't work and you're left to trial and error, honestly that would make sense in the story as well. You're not the first, and others sure as hell have come this far to get stuck too. It won't lock you down to this, however. Your list of options for trial and error are usually limited enough to not have to spend forever trying different things. And if you don't have the solution already, there are other places to visit. Much of the world of Lunacid is optional too. Who knows, the place you think is the most necessary next step may be completely bypassable. It may be something you find the key for later. It may even be the place you exit from the other side. I literally found the final boss on accident, in the sense that I was quite certain the area I was in was going to lead to another area. Turned out I actually missed the library, completely. Didn't think to go back to that spot that was clearly signposted in a way you could go, because by the time I could get to it, I had so much other cool stuff to go see and do. Get distracted, get lost, explore. There's rewards to find in all the ways the game can offer it. From powerful equipment to lore, like a lot of lore actually, just packed away and hidden from you, to the way environmental storytelling adds to the world, to the references to everything that inspired the game, all the way down to different endings based on what you've done and how much you've paid attention doing it. This, unfortunately, leads me to some of the weaker aspects of Lunacid, a necessary balance in doing a review. First and foremost, things happen during a full moon. A shitload of things can be missed if you play through in between full moons. In fact, one of the endings requires you to do certain things during one. And I don't recall the game ever stating that. One aspect of the full moon is that the closer you are to one, the quicker you build lunacy in-game. This is a mechanic that raises the damage output from all sources, yours and the enemy's, but it's built by casting spells, and the rate at which it's built depends on the time of the month. That's pretty neat, and not so heavy that it's intrusive, but the problem lies with everything else that changes to fit the system. I found a brutal mini-boss in a secret early on in my playthrough, and put a lot of effort into beating it. It was pretty cool, but that was the only time I saw it. I started a second playthrough and it wasn't even there. So I looked online to see if I triggered it somehow, and the first time, without knowing, yes, I did trigger it. By playing on a full moon. It's only there once a month. I get what Kira was going for with this mechanic, and I like it on paper. It's a pretty cool concept. In practice, it changes up some things a bit too hard. Yes, sure, you can change your system clock to match the moon pattern, but, I don't know. Seems like a bit much for how the design was intended. There's also no New Game Plus option. I feel like this game would be a perfect candidate for NG+. Already, the final boss can be beaten and allow you to return to the game as it was. I mean, that's great and all, no complaints there. I just kinda wish there was an option for taking your character through the world again at a heavily upscaled difficulty. Before you think it doesn't make sense, consider the source of the inspirations. FromSoft cemented the use of an NG+. The final boss of Lunacid is a massive endurance test. He takes chip damage at best, and unless you built specifically for evading attacks by a mile, he will hit you, and it will hurt. It's not impossible. I'm not sure it's even that difficult compared to some of the other fights in the game. The flow of combat is just completely different here. This is the one time the combat felt like it lost its edge. Stock up on health potions, maybe mana potions too, and just stay moving and attacking. Some of his attacks will miss easily, other ones won't miss. You just have to do it long enough to whittle him down to a certain point. To say any more is heavy lore spoilage, so find that one out on yourself, and I encourage that. Oh, and one more thing, he will cause status effects. Status effects in Lunacid are a mixed bag. Let me explain. I am not entirely sure that the resistance stat is working properly, because it's supposed to reduce the amount of time that you spend with a status ailment. There are varying degrees of status ailments, and some of them will go away quickly enough on their own, while others will last long enough to flatline you twice over if you don't take care of them. This works for the most part because you can always buy more status ailment cures at the store. This shop does offer some neat weapons, and sometimes at a high price. There's just one thing I don't seem to get about the shop though. The prices of consumables fluctuate wildly, just the consumables. It did get to a point where I thought the prices went up based on the amount I already had, and then it surprised me yet again when I had 30 health potions and saw the cheapest prices yet. In conclusion, the high notes that the game hits, it hits hard. There's such a great care and attention to detail when the game is referencing something that it drew inspiration from, that the passion really shines through. In contrast, if you didn't know or weren't familiar with the media that it does draw inspiration from, it's handled in such a way that breathes its own legacy into it. If you've never played King's Field, this is still a great game. However, if you have, then this is like doing it again but seeing everything for the first time. If it was too samey, you'd have too much built-up understanding. This aspect really helps to heighten the experience to its own level. Kira came into this with a clear understanding of what it means to draw inspiration from something and create something new out of it. Obviously, this isn't completely new territory, it is heavily inspired by King's Field. You won't be confused into thinking it's the same thing though. The flow state of Lunacid is that of mystery and wonder. You're supposedly here to escape the pit. How will you do that? Where will you go? What will you see? Will you survive? You'll be asking questions and finding answers you didn't expect. You'll be surprised and you'll be lost. Most of all, if you're here for it, you'll be dedicated. If you stuck around this long and this game looks interesting to you, please don't even hesitate. Lunacid is an absolute banger. At first, I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but the more time I spent with it, the better it got, and the more the experience became mine just as much as it was the game's. This, I would love to see a sequel. This one could turn into a series. So, thank you for letting me ramble on about a game I liked. Hopefully, I can inspire someone to check it out. It was worth it. I came into this expecting to find something I liked, as you do when you get into a game. I found something truly worth the experience. It's awesome. If any of what I said appeals to you, I'm sure you'll find it awesome too if you give it a shot. Take it easy. I'm out.